Hello all. Today we're going to do day 5 of the Hume reading. This is section 5, skeptical solution of these doubts. And these doubts, namely, are the doubts about matters of fact and whether we can justifiably infer about the future or make any sort of inductive generalizations. So before I provide this skeptical solution or give it a rundown, I'm going to do a review. So I posted this little document here to the website Scholar in the main resources tab under week 3, but I guess it'll do some good to explain it, although if you've done the reading, most of the stuff should be fairly obvious. So starting with day 1, well, this skips directly to day 2 because day 1 is a general discussion. So day 2, so this is the origin of ideas reading. So there's impressions, right? And impressions are the immediate sense experience. So in the moment, what it's like to be perceiving this talk, or to see the color of your keyboard, or the color of the various other things around you, that is an impression. Impressions aren't just limited to like visual experience, it can be auditory experience, it can even be your own sort of emotional psychological state. So the feeling that you have when you will, or when you care about someone or something like that, that also counts as an impression. So all ideas are derived from impressions. And this is a general principle that Hume thinks applies in all cases except for that one strange exception, the missing shade of blue. But in general, he has two arguments for why all ideas are derived from impressions. Namely, one, pick any given idea and you can show that it's derived from an impression. So you just pick anything you want and you can give a Humean story for how the origin of that idea is ultimately a matter of having had some sense experience, and we thereby recollect and suitably modify that impression to make an idea. So take the example of a golden mountain or a unicorn. You take a mountain and you take a goldish color, you sort of transpose them, and then you get a golden mountain. Or a unicorn is a thing, a horse, and then a horn, and you just mash them together. And so you should be able to do this with any other sort of thing. So, and then the other argument is that you can't have an idea without an impression. And so this is the one where he talks about you can't appreciate the relish of wine if you've never had wine. You don't know what it tastes like. And so the same thing might go for someone that's colorblind, or if you've never been, I don't know, scuba diving or something. I don't think I've never been scuba diving. I have no good idea of what that's like. The only idea that I possibly do have is derived from my various secondhand impressions of seeing it on television and that sort of thing. So that these two arguments justify this sort of inference. And then, and then there's the association of ideas reading that I didn't make a distinct video on because it's pretty straightforward. And this just makes an account. So there's simple ideas, right? So there's these just I see something that's a certain shade, and then I remember that shade later, and that's just kind of a simple idea of that shade. So I have a white coffee cup, and then I close my eyes and think about it, and I have this sort of simple idea. And then you can have more complex ideas, mashing together various simple ideas. So all of those ideas can be explained, all of those complex ideas can be explained in terms of resemblance, contiguity, cause and effect. So one thing looks like another, and we can just kind of make this leap of inference. Contiguity is like on a spectrum of the way things are. So maybe if you think of something that's really strong, you can think of something that's way stronger, and then you have one of the properties of the Hulk, and that's how we can have an idea of super strength or something like that. And of course, the most important one is cause and effect, and this is all sorts of ideas about the way things in the world occur. So I have ideas about a wide range of how various things relate to me and to other things. So I have an idea of a sandwich, and part of that idea is that it causes a certain effect in me, namely to be nourished and satiated, my appetite to be satiated. So that's that story. So now, after we have this basic framework, and this is supposed to be that sort of, as I talked about it as sort of the general project of the Newton of the mind, in which Hume uses a few simple principles and commonsensical arguments and to come about very general principles. So this is the fusing of the methods from the first day of reading, in which on the one hand these are sort of commonsensical things that you can on some level agree with what he's saying about all ideas come from impressions, um, and you can't have an idea without an impression. But on the other hand, it's a very powerful thesis at the end of the day that can explain everything you can imagine, basically, like literally. So um, that's those elements. So in terms of making sense of knowledge, which is the general project of the early modern period, um, early modern philosophers such as Descartes, right, the father of early modern philosophy, really had an emphasis on epistemology in a way that was sort of unprecedented. And so Hume kind of follows this vein, but in his own way, but it's still an epistemic project to a certain extent. I say to a certain extent just because there's scholarly debate as to whether he was really more of a philosopher of mind or an epistemologist. Don't worry about that. So, in terms of knowledge, Hume maintains that there's just two general forms that knowledge can take. So remember, Descartes had three for some reason. He also thought, so there's reason, the senses, and imagination. Hume pretty much just has reason or the senses, and he calls these instead relations of ideas or matters of fact. So what's distinctive about relations of ideas is that they can come about by mere thought alone. So the sort of test, even though this is a loose way of putting it, is that if you can just close your eyes and sit back in your chair and come to knowledge, that's a relation of idea. You don't have to do any empirical observation. And so examples of this include geometry or conceptual analysis. Valid deductive arguments tend to be of this form. So the premises might be matters of fact, but the fact that an argument is valid is just a structural feature that's a relation of the way. I mean, it's a pretty literal case of relation of ideas. The premises relate in such a way to where, if they're true, the conclusion must be true. So that's a relational property. And interestingly, relations of ideas, if negated, entail a contradiction. So all this means, I know it sounds like a mouthful, is that take some true relation of idea. So I've been using a bachelor is an unmarried man. Stick with that. If you just maintain that a bachelor is not an unmarried man, this is just a contradiction of terms, because what it means to be a bachelor is to be an unmarried man. So it's just akin to saying 2 plus 2 equals 3 or something like that. Or does not equal 4 would be a more direct negation. So these are just contradictions, right? So they're just manifestly impossible. They just don't make any sense. It's not something, a good test of whether or not it's a sort of relation of idea is if it's imaginable. So on the one hand, I can't imagine a married bachelor or a three-sided square or that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But on the other hand, I can imagine, say, the sun not rising or being able to breathe underwater. So this other category, this is a way of moving across into matters of fact. So matters of fact are things that we know by observation through the senses, and as I noted, their negation does not entail a contradiction. So you can imagine the sun not rising. That seems possible. Likewise, you can imagine putting your hand into a fire and it having no sensible effect, or it gently tickling, or something like that. You can imagine letting go of a cup and it just floating there, it going upwards, it doing any number of things. So, and this is a very powerful sort of um, consideration because it'll be the basis of the dilemma that Hume uses to generate what has now been called the problem of induction. Of course, Hume didn't ever use that term, but that's how it's identified today. So our knowledge, all of our interesting knowledge about the world comes from matters of fact. It's a sort of observation. This is just relations of ideas. It's just kind of rearranging things that are derived from matters of fact anyway, because as we know from Hume, or as Hume states, all knowledge or all ideas come from impressions, right? So everything to begin with is a matter of sense experience. And then once we have that, we just rearrange it in various ways, and that's relations of ideas. So the fountainhead of knowledge is impressions. So we go back to the roots and try to figure out what's the basis of justification for our observations for matters of fact. And these are all based on cause and effect. And this is just what Hume says. So the question is, what justifies inferences about cause and effect? Or as I'll call them, causal inferences. So here again, you'll see the sort of relation of ideas thing being invoked. So it's not known independently of experience, so it's not a priori, it's not a relation of ideas, for all the reasons I just sort of already talked about. And one of the other arguments that he uses is that if you pick any entirely unknown object and try to predict its effects, you'll of course be failing utterly. So there's all sorts of weird properties of objects. So if you were given, a certain stone and were to tell me everything about it, and then you turn off the lights and you find out it's one of those crazy glow-in-the-dark rocks that's just naturally occurring, there's no way you could have predicted that prior to having any experience or any chemistry background or geology or whatnot. So it doesn't seem like we can know, independent of experience, relations of cause and effect. Cause and effect is only known, and we only make causal inferences after experience. But this leads to the circularity problem. So the circularity problem is, I've put it one way, you could probably put it in another way, or better even. I say, so experience is used to justify causal inferences, which justify matters of fact. And as we know, judgments about matters of fact are from experience. So judgments about experience are used to justify other judgments about experience at the end of the day, right? So what justifies matters of fact? Cause and effect. And what justifies cause and effect? Experience. But what are matters of fact? They're inferences based on observation in the senses, namely experience. So it's circular. So on the one hand, we can't so the general problem then is that we don't have any way to justify our knowledge. Relations of ideas won't get us anywhere because, of course, matters of fact just aren't deductively certain. And then matters of fact won't do it because it's question begging to invoke past experience to justify experience. Okay, so now that we've done that big overview, we're in a position to move on with today's stuff. This reading was relatively straightforward. He repeats himself a bit, but for the most part, he just has a few final thoughts. So, in the very intro section to this reading, he just has some general remarks about philosophy, and I abbreviate that to Phil. So one thing that he's well aware of is that philosophy may push us to excesses we are already predisposed to. So he says, on the one hand, philosophy, like religion, is supposed to make us better, make us more decent human beings or something like that. Maybe philosophy is trying to make us more rational. But there's this very real danger that we will just, if you become educated in philosophy, you can just become an excellent sophist or something like that and use your understanding and your training to justify whatever sort of thing you already wanted to do, or bad argument. You ever argue with that friend that can persuade you of anything, but you know they're wrong, you just don't know why. That's the sort of worry. So, but one sort of philosophy that's not so prone to this is skeptical philosophy, because it deprives us of any sort of position, because we're always sort of agnostic about anything that could be. And this is more just a fun observation. It's not a big picture issue, but it's just one of the many remarks that Hume makes that I find um, well put. He says, philosophy makes many enemies by opposing so many vices and follies. It uh, raises to itself abundance of enemies. So you always hear, and this is a bit of a tangent. So um, you always, sometimes you'll be asked as a philosophy student, um, what are you going to do with that, or what does philosophy do? And the sort of question is one about like how are you going to generate capital? And that seems to be, I mean, it's a practical concern, but in a certain way, it's kind of beside the point because you might have worries that just trying to produce more money isn't the best way to live. So Hume was well aware of this even in his time, and a sort of any sort of system of thinking that will question any sort of assumption about lifestyle choices or about beliefs um, will come under scrutiny. So that's more just an interesting thought that he has as an aside. Um, but one thing he says, and this is kind of a continuation of his reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions that I highlighted at the beginning of the week. Um, one thing that he reminds us is that we don't need to worry that philosophy will undermine reasoning of common life. It's a very rare soul that if you're someone that gets genuinely influenced by argument alone. There are few people that will just do that. And so on the whole, it doesn't seem like we have much to worry about. So even if we have these major skeptical doubts and you're fully understanding of why we're not justified in making inductive inferences about the future, I mean, I'm still going to go eat dinner right after this. I'm not going to wonder, will dinner really nourish me? And all sorts of other things. We just kind of keep living. So at the end of the day, although philosophy has these various uh, features to it, and there's no genuine worry. And this last point will become more prevalent as we move on. So this is one last sort of rendition of Hume's argument that all understanding of cause and effect is a posteriori. It's dependent upon experience. It's after experience. So he says, suppose a person be brought into the world suddenly, and you could do this a little bit more fun by making it the alien. That's what I do. But you could just imagine Star Trek or something, and there's just some, I don't know, maybe Star Trek's a bad example. Some creature that spontaneously generates out of goo. Lightning strikes, and the swamp creature comes out of the ground, and it's fully conscious and just like us, except for it has no experience whatsoever. And it'll look around and it'll see stuff happening, but it won't see causes. So causes aren't something that are just manifest around us. You don't just immediately know that this causes that. You kind of have to find out through a succession of the same thing happening repeatedly, and then you begin to make certain sorts of associations. So from the senses alone, there's just one thing following another. It's not like there's this third additional thing that is a cause, that is something that we see separate from one thing and then the next thing. All we see is one thing and then the next thing. And then we just assume that that just means that there must be a hidden cause underpinning that constant conjunction. And so Hume asks, if you repeat this same thing 1,000 times, why would this give us any more justification? So if the inference isn't justified the first time that A causes B, why would 1,000 repetitions make it more legitimate? I can't believe I read through all those typos when I did this. So, right, if in the first case all you see is event A happening and then event B happening, and there's no way to say there's a cause, how would we know with any sort of certainty that there is a cause if we just keep doing the same thing over and over again? It's kind of just like saying, I know I'm right. And if you just do that enough times, all of a sudden you do become right. It doesn't seem like that follows. It just seems like question begging to a grand extent 1,000 times consecutively isn't going to get you any closer to having a justified account of causation. So that's another way of putting the problem. So this is the alien. Um, so now we get to Hume's actual solution to the problem. So Hume says this is a matter ultimately of custom or habit. And one reason why I say this is a skeptical solution is because you might think this isn't intellectually satisfying. And so all I mean by this is that he doesn't set out a problem with, a kind of a faux problem that at the end of the day he solves and shows everyone how brilliant he is and how, oh, look, there was no problem, but there seemed to be this deep problem. He points to a problem and then ultimately concludes, yeah, this is still a really big problem, but we're just going to keep living the way we already live. So it's a skeptical solution insofar as there is no good answer. The only sort of answer that we can hope to achieve is just, well, you can't expect philosophy to override the reasoning of common life. And so that's why that initial introductory couple paragraphs is relevant even here when he lays down his final solution. So custom is just a repetition of an act which produces a certain propensity. So this isn't really any special technical sense of custom or habit, but it's just like you make certain sorts of habits even if they're not well justified. Maybe you could think of some sort of operant conditioning or something where every time a bell rings, you associate it with food, and then you become to you make this habit of predicting that food will come as a result of the bell. But of course, there's no causal relationship between the two. We don't think there is. Not even everyday people think that there's a causal relationship between a bell ringing and food arriving. But we just tend to sort of build up these inferences, even if they're not rationally justified. And it's just that same sort of matter of custom or habit. So here's just some other examples. Flame then heat, smoke then fire. Once again, there's nothing necessary underpinning these sorts of correlations. It's perfectly conceivable that there's just smoke coming from the ground and there's no fire, and it's just continuous smoke generating for who knows what reason. But we tend to make these sorts of customary assumptions. So, and Hume says in very general terms, all inferences from experience, therefore, are effects of custom, not of reasoning. So at the end of the day, all of our thinking about the world, our conjectures about science, about medicine, or those various sorts of things, they're not deeply rationally justified. They're just justified because that's the sorts of beings that we are. It might be wrong to even say they're justified. They're just customary because we're the sort of organism that has to make these inferences to continue living. You might think it's part of the way that the structure of our psyche is. We were just selected to make these kinds of inferences, and there's nothing more to it than that. So that's the solution. It's a matter of custom or habit. And just a little bit more on this point. So Hume says it's the great guide of human life. So the thought here is just that when we're deliberating, when we're doing any sort of predictions or those sorts of things, people are much more prone to rely on what is customary, what they have habitually experienced, as opposed to any robust reasoning. If you've ever dealt with sort of an elder, maybe a grandparent or something like that, you probably have had this experience where, these are the way things are and were and are supposed to be, and you can try to argue with them about how it's not rational and how they can't justifiably make this sort of inference that chicken noodle soup is really that great for you or something like that. But they'll always just say that's the way we do things. So, yeah, just sort of a psychological, sociological observation that, as a matter of fact, it just so happens that custom is what gets people moving. So, again, Hume rehashes a bit and he says, recall once again, just kind of summing up the whole big picture now. This is part of his conclusion that matters of fact are derived from impressions. Remember, all ideas are derived from impressions, so of course, ideas about matters of fact would be as well. So even history, I don't know why he says even history, but even mathematics, for one, is a matter of uh, impressions ultimately. So if you go back far enough, you'll realize that at some point it was some sort of experience that resulted in every sort of basic idea that allowed us to do any sort of work. And this is just kind of him reaffirming his empiricist bent. And then this is probably the best summation that I could find. He just says, all belief of matter of fact or real existence is derived merely from some object present to the senses, memory or senses, and a customary conjunction between that and some other object. So I'll break this down a little bit more. So all belief of matter of fact or real existence is merely derived from some object present to the memory and senses. So this is just a story of impressions. So all matters of fact are ultimately derived from impressions, and in addition to impressions, we make causal inferences by making a sort of conjunction between that impression and some other idea or impression. And this conjunction is merely a matter of custom. It's a customary conjunction. It's not a rationally justified conjunction or some sort of necessary connection. It's just a customary conjunction. It's just some habit of we put this thing after this thing. And that's just the way we are. So I hope that helps. We'll be moving on to a little different format next week. So ask any questions if you're confused. And I'll see you next time.